All right, go. You're recording. Stop dancing with the shock, you weirdo. I love you.
Today we're going to talk about Fox shock rebuilding and talk about how long it takes to get them rebuilt, how much it costs, and some tips I would have for the process. So first of all, Fox Performance, these are 2.5-inch reservoir shocks, very similar to King shocks, Icon shocks. They will basically have a very similar interval of time for rebuild. These are rated to run somewhere around 50,000 miles if you're on road, and if you're racing, you might have to rebuild them every race. Now for us, we ended up having to rebuild this after about 20,000 miles, which isn't real great, but we have run it off-road fairly heavily, so it's not terrible. Now, how do you know that it's time to rebuild one of these shocks? Well, the first thing is you'll start seeing oil seep out of the shock, and typically it'll start getting a little bit oily out of the shock and out the bottom of the shock. We only had one of the front shocks that was starting to seep just a little bit, and we probably could have gotten away with a little bit longer service. However, we needed to revalve all of our shocks and drop the valving just a little bit, so that way when the truck is unloaded, it would just give it a little bit better ride quality with the adjusters turned all the way down. So, how long does it take to rebuild these guys? Well, typically AccuTune gives about a 4 to 6 week time window for rebuild, and it can vary, so you want to call them and find out. Now these shocks did come from AccuTune brand new, which one of the great things about it was that they valve it specifically for your truck application, as well as they provide a free revalve if it doesn't work out, which was great in our case that we could get these things revalved for free. However, since that one shock was leaking, I decided why not just rebuild all 4 shocks. Let's pull them all off the truck, get them shipped into them. In our case, we ended up shipping them in, and by the time we got them shipped back to us, it was right at 2 weeks, which was great. So you're talking basically a week turnaround once they got the shocks. That was awesome, super happy. Thank you guys for getting them back to us so quickly. But you need to expect a bit longer turnaround. Now we were planning on a bit of a longer turnaround and wanted to still keep driving the truck. The problem was for us is we didn't have shocks to put back on it, and our stock rear shocks were completely blown out after only one off-road trip with it, and it was probably a 2-week trip. They were completely blown. So these shocks are definitely a lot more durable than the stock shocks. However, we ended up ordering some interns cheapo shocks from 4 Wheel Parts, just some Pro Comp shocks. I think it was a few $100 for all 4 of them. They're proper length for the truck being lifted. So in the future, when we get these things rebuilt, I'll just slap on those shocks, and so we can at least still drive around town a bit more comfortable with having the shocks sent out for rebuild. Now, the front stock shocks that we had on the truck, we still had those because they were taken off when it was brand new. However, because the truck is lifted, basically they were fully extended at ride height, so there was absolutely no down travel. And I drove it around a bit with it like that, and it was just a really harsh ride. Probably damaged the shocks just because it had no way to go down, no suspension travel. So the next question is, how much does it cost to rebuild these shocks? Well, we ended up shipping them to AccuTune, and we bought the shipping insurance. It cost us right about $100 for both boxes. So about $50 per set of shocks for the front and the rear. Now then they thankfully gave us the rebuild or the revalve for free, but the rebuilding labor was $90 a shock. So you're talking $360 for all 4 of those shocks. And then they charged for the rebuild kit from Fox, which was $17 per shock, $68 total, and 1 gallon of shock fluid, the oil, and that was $65. So all in, we were at $493, plus we had return shipping cost at $38, so we're at about $531 plus the shipping it to them. So somewhere around $625, $630 for both shipping, both directions, and the rebuild cost. That's not cheap. That's a hefty bill to pay, especially considering our shocks were a year and a half on the truck. It's pretty expensive for sure, and that was only 20,000 miles. But for the performance that you get with these shocks, there's really no alternative to it. And if you do keep them on the road a little more, you'll probably get more miles out of them. Another tip, if you're looking to extend the life of these shocks, is to get yourself some shock boots. And we had the shock boots on all 4 shocks, which this is really helpful because one of the big issues you run into with these shocks failing is that if the shaft gets pitted at all, it just tears up the seals. The same as if you get any sort of sand or grit, anything that gets stuck to the shaft, and it'll be a little bit oily, so it will get everything stuck to it. That when it slides up and in to the shock, it's going to tear up those seals. So a really easy thing to do is get some shock boots. I know it's helped out a lot with these shocks for the stuff that we've driven it through, but I was a little disappointed that we weren't closer to 30,000 miles on the rebuild, but it is what it is with that. Now, our intention was to get them sent back anyways to revalve all 4. We needed to just reduce that valving just a little bit to make the ride slightly more compliant when the truck is empty and we have that adjuster turned all the way down. So this should help us out with that. And I figured since we're sending them in, let's just go ahead and get them rebuilt at the same time and just see how that whole experience is. And the last tip I would give for rebuilding your shocks is keep your original box that you got these shocks shipped to you. It's going to make it so much easier to rebox them and ship them back, and less expensive to not have to figure out packaging for them or risk damaging them. The other thing to consider with running performance shocks is that if you have any other internal damage or external damage to these shocks, that's going to be additional cost for the rebuild. The rebuild cost that I had was that the shocks were in good repair internally, and they basically just need to be resealed and put back together. These could cost a lot more money if you end up damaging one of them. So that's something to keep in mind if you do damage a shock, whether or not it's even worth trying to rebuild it or just get it replaced. Is it worth rebuilding these shocks? Well, this shock costs $650 to $700 per shock, and the rebuild was $160. However, you do have to deal with the downtime while the shock gets sent off to be rebuilt and the time it takes to take the shocks off. And if you're installing temporary shocks, you'll have to decide if it's worth it or not. My suggestion would be if the shock is in good condition externally and it looks as though it's just starting to seep, it's not a big deal, certainly worth rebuilding it. If you get it smashed on a rock or damaged externally or the shaft gets pitted, I would probably look more to just replacing it, just because you might end up spending most of the cost of the shock in rebuild cost and it would still be a used shock. You also have to keep in mind that installing and removing the shocks does take some time. It took me about 2 hours to get them pulled out, boxed up, and shipped out. I'll show you quickly how I do it with one person and just simple tools so you can get an idea. It's not that difficult, but it does take some time. Something else to consider if you're taking these things off for rebuild is that it is a little bit of labor too. On the rear shocks, I attach the top bolt, get that snugged up first, and then I use a floor jack with a large socket. This is 27 millimeter, and that basically allows me to jack up the shock and compress it in a controlled manner, and I can kind of push and slide it into place and then put the bolt through. That makes it so much easier to get the shock in without fighting it. These are under a lot of pressure, and if you're trying to just manhandle it in, it's quite a thing. And your other option is to try to droop out the suspension, which that just takes a lot more time to try to jack the whole truck up. And you can see the front's basically the same thing. Secure the top bolt of the shock first and mount the reservoir, and then just using that socket, and you definitely have to kind of push and hold everything to keep it from moving around. get it positioned where you want, but you can just basically jack it up and kind of roll the jack into place, and you can get it close enough to start that bolt, and then you can pop it with a mallet and get it on through. It's a lot easier doing it this way than trying to droop out the suspension. I want to give you a quick update as well on the Fox steering stabilizer. Now, you had seen that I had mentioned that it was at a fairly steep angle because originally they designed the stabilizer for a stock height truck. And part of the problem with that was that this little O-ring at the frame mount side was getting a little bit blown out because it was twisted more than it needed to be. And I had talked to Fox about designing a little drop bracket or whatnot for that frame side of the shock, and they did. I will put a link in the description below, but you can get this little drop and the bolt for free from Fox, and I'll give you in the description below information about that. But it basically is a machined, looks like piece of steel or aluminum spacer that will drop that frame mount down by a good 1.25 inches, and a new nice, looks like grade 10 bolt to secure it. So I'll show you what it looks like with it installed when I get put on there. It reduced our angle quite a bit. We're now at about 11.5 degrees up angle, and you can see it's a lot flatter now with this new spacer. It's a really nice machine piece. You basically take out the machined upper piece, and this replaces it. And the O-rings now, top and bottom, aren't puking out because the angle is much less. All those are, from what I can tell, is just keep dust and dirt out of the bearing. So that's great. I'm going to adjust the clamp mount on the drag link a little bit just because it shifted it just slightly, and it's getting awful close to this stop here when it's fully turned. So we'll make a little adjustment there. But otherwise, it looks pretty good. I think this should be a nice little upgrade. Now, the reason you want the stabilizer fairly level is because it's going to allow it to be a lot more effective, because it's going to have a lot more force. That hasn't been a problem for us. We've only adjusted our stabilizer to just over 50% from its baseline adjustment. But it is great because it should allow the stabilizer to work a little less hard and for have a little bit more effect. And hopefully that little O-ring won't be quite so twisted on there as well. Our shock rebuild is complete. Shocks are installed. Took 2 hours to get them all installed, mounted, and dialed in. Good to go again. And I got that steering mount spacer installed. And I guess total time was 4 hours between the removal and the install. Not terrible. It is a bit of a hassle with these performance shocks, and they're not inexpensive. However, you really can't beat the performance. I just wish they would be able to go a little longer interval. We'll keep you updated on that. Maybe we can get 30 or 40,000 miles on this rebuild. Stay tuned for that. If you have any questions, post them below, and be sure to check out the description. I'll put some information on the rebuild as well as the steering stabilizer. Thanks for watching. Give us a thumbs up. We'll catch you later.